I should apologize for not being an actuary, and I'll give you a perspective on outcomes that's probably not that kind of radically different from what many of you would perceive, but as you've heard, my background is really originally in clinical medicine and then in broader management consulting and in fact in economics. My involvement in this, I suppose, goes all the way back to my experience as a clinician, which was quite a long time ago when I last did any clinical work, but I'm still acutely aware of some of the instances when superiors of mine, and I was a pretty junior doctor, kind of asked me to do things or did things themselves which were, in my view, patently not supported by the evidence. And there was no questioning of them either by their peers or anybody else. And I suppose ever since then I've had this, I wouldn't say deeply skeptical, but certainly a healthy mistrust of passed down knowledge within healthcare, and that's kind of driven my curiosity in a lot of the work I've done. What I'm going to be speaking to you now is, in a sense, I suppose, what I've been formulating is my response to that skepticism and how I can deal with it and make my way through the world on that. And that's really through scientifically, doggedly, persistently measuring the outcomes that patients experience and trying to add that together with all other things that happen in healthcare to make sense of all of this. So, this equation is something that everybody in this room would deal with on an almost daily basis. If we're looking at value for money for premium payers, for governments, for individual insurees, this notion of balancing the costs with the outcomes is pretty much intrinsic to any payer's role once they have a claim. Certainly, though, from the perspective I've come from, which is more probably a policymaker perspective, that cost dimension has dominated. And one of the reasons it's dominated is people have come up with all kinds of objections as to why outcomes for patients can't be incorporated in the equation to really measure value. So a convenient shortcut becomes just to look at costs. And what I thought I'd do is just address in a very simple, quick way some of those, what I've called the myths about why we can't measure outcomes. And my feeling is certainly that we can. We're already doing it, and we can do a lot more of it. So what are those myths? Okay, first of all, the one that certainly was imbued in me as a medical student was, well, treatment's pretty standardized. You all learn the same thing in medical school. You learn the same thing in your clinical training, and as they end up, we churn out these doctors like little carbon copies of each other that all do exactly the same thing for the rest of their lives. The second myth is that, if you're giving similar treatment, the outcomes are generally the same for similar patients. So not only are outcomes the same across the board for everybody, but once you drill down into individual patients and individual treatments, they're the same as well. The third myth that I'll speak to is the mortality one. Now, almost all of you in the room will immediately say, well, of course we don't believe that survival is the only relevant kind of outcome from any form of health or health-related intervention. But the reality is we still measure most things, and I'll give some cancer examples of this later on, largely in terms of survival, our success in treating them. So even if it's not most important to patients, it still is the currency that we most commonly use in practice and in payment. And the fourth one there is, well, even if we could do all of these things, measure them, measure outcomes that are relevant, get a good view of them down to the individual patient level, it's not going to actually change what doctors do. They'll be doing what they were always taught before, and they're not going to kind of believe it's too threatening for them to believe a set of evidence like this. And then fifthly, if we could bust all of these myths, and we could prove that we could do all of this, it would actually just end up too costly to do it. So even if it might be feasible, the cost and effort required to measure outcomes and actually base our decisions on those outcomes is never going to be funded. So I'm going to try and knock them off one by one, in fact, pretty quickly, because I've probably only got about 7 minutes left. So Let's go. Okay, treatment standardized. I'm going to use lots of examples that don't relate to the injury and disability world. Apologies. My standard slide deck, which is you're getting elements of, has all kinds of healthcare examples, not just injury and disability ones, but I'm sure you can draw the analogies. Colonoscopy, very good one. You can pretty much give somebody as many colonoscopies as they will tolerate before they can refuse to come back and see you again as a gastroenterologist. And you'd be surprised at how many colonoscopies some people do get. Now this is from Victoria. This chart, it shows you the rates of colonoscopy, and this is per 100,000 people in SLAs in Victoria. And you'll see that actually, the region with the highest rates of colonoscopy is getting over 4,000. And the lowest rates are typically in regional areas that are undersupplied, not very high, not very far from nothing. So enormous variation in the treatments we give. This is a classic treatment where you can really give as many as you're able to supply. Certainly the constraints aren't there from a point of view of paying for it, because Medicare pays for actually an unlimited number of colonoscopies. There's no limit on that. And it's also, obviously bound by the number of gastroenterologists you have to give them. So does it actually make a difference? Well, this goes to the kind of variation in outcomes. If we look at rates of essentially what we've got there on the y-axis is the mortality to incidence ratio. So it's effectively the best proxy we have for the mortality rate of cancer. And you expect if colonoscopies are doing something useful, you'd be picking them up earlier, and people would be the mortality to incidence rate would be lower. But actually, as you'll see, there's no relationship between the mortality to incidence ratio and the number of colonoscopies being done. And this isn't just applied to Australian statistics, nor just to kind of small area variation. This is a chart constructed, it's a bit out of date now, it's 2008-9 for the OECD. And you're looking at a whole lot of outcome indicators that are routinely tracked by the OECD for a variety of conditions. So you'll see there's a few diabetic conditions, some cancer outcomes, mortality following acute myocardial infarct or a heart attack. And in many of these instances, the yellow line there is the OECD average. You'll see there are typically 1, 2, 3 countries that are more than 3 times the OECD mean for all of those, and pretty much all of them have cases where there are countries below half the OECD mean as well. So that essentially represents a 6-fold difference between high and low on all of these indicators. So we certainly see a lot of variation between countries as well, and these are countries that are pretty much the same level of income. So it's this isn't comparing developed with developing countries. So we've got all this variation, between both between individual kind of small areas, countries, and in terms of the outcomes that we generate from the interventions. What can we actually do about it? So one more slide just on the variation piece, and I think this is interesting because it shows you where some of the variation comes from as well. This is looking at data from the Netherlands on breast cancer treatment. Now you'll see on the chart on the left there that we're measuring on the y-axis the rate at which residual cancer tissue is left behind after surgery. So that's a bad outcome. When you have your cancer surgery, you want them to remove all of the cancer tissue. If it's being left behind, then there's an error, and they're going to have to either give you adjuvant treatments, or radiotherapy or chemotherapy, or maybe even reoperate. And you'll see that there's this very strong apparent relationship between the number of cases that a hospital treats and the rate at which they leave tissue behind. So you'll see the smallest hospitals doing less than 100 cancer patients per annum have, on average, the highest rate of residual tissue left behind. However, that's really only half the story. When you look at within each of those, you see this enormous variation. So, actually, we get, as much variation, and certainly in the smaller institutions, enormous amounts of variation. There's no variation in the greater than 400 one because there's only one institution with more than 400 cases. And certainly there are some instances where we've got small hospitals actually giving really good results. So it's more than just size and volume and experience that's driving this. So what might it be? And I think this is in a sense, for me, creates the case for measurement, is that in a very sophisticated system with a lot of measurement and data and enormous amounts of money being spent on it, that's 180 billion per annum in Australia on healthcare, we still have so much unexplained variation. One more I always like to kind of give an equal gender kind of set of scares to the audience. So you've had the breast cancer one, now you get the prostate cancer one. The prostate cancer, interestingly, this goes to kind of talk about what we actually measure. And what we've found, particularly in measurement of outcomes in cancer, is that the typical outcome which every oncologist talks to about their patients about, which is something called 5-year mortality, is actually the area where we've, whether it's cause or effect is debatable, where we've reduced the variation most. So this is looking at 3 different settings. Germany, the whole of Germany, the whole of Sweden, and a particular clinic called the Martini Clinic in Germany, which is the world's largest prostate cancer treatment facility. So if you think of your previous slide around volumes, these guys should be the best in terms of the volumes that they do in one institution. And they've got pretty much identical 5-year survival rates and very high rates. So, and this would go with the experience. And most oncologists will tell you that prostate cancer is very common in elderly men, but very rarely kills them. So 95% of people are surviving in 5 years with their prostate cancer. But actually, survival's not really the critical thing here. When we look at the variation in 2 of the key side effects from treatment of prostate cancer, incontinence and erectile dysfunction, we see much more variation. So you see there the high volume institute, the Martini Clinic on the right-hand side, actually has substantially lower, from about a bit more than 1/5 of the rate of urinary incontinence and less than half the rate of erectile dysfunction compared to the other institutions or other countries on average. So, and this is something we see across measuring in a lot of areas in healthcare now, is that actually the things we have historically focused on, we've reduced the variation in, but we've actually had variation either blow out or remain in the areas we haven't looked closely at, and that is increasingly the kind of quality of life dimensions of healthcare. So to my last 2 myths here, does it make any difference then that we can measure these things? What can we do about them? And the obvious thing that people come up with is, we should be publicly reporting this variation. We should be not paying doctors who have bad outcomes, or hospitals that have bad outcomes. And the first kind of almost therapy for this is almost certainly just giving that information back to people. And this is part of a movement that has kind of been going probably for the better part of 30 years in various places of the world, but is certainly getting a lot more attention now in form of clinical outcomes registries, where people are tracking patients for long periods after they've been treated and following them up to see what their outcomes actually are, and then feeding that information back to the clinicians who originally treated them. It's not a radical idea. Most people out there in the general public think, well, surely they must know this. And they don't, and the simple reason they don't is because most patient kind of contacts are initiated by the patient, so they only come back if they've got something wrong. They might not come back to you, certainly if it's 5 or 10 years later. And even if they do come back to you, your sample size as any one clinician is very small. So this is information that is actually proven to be very powerful if you can feed it back to people in a useful way. So this looks at, in that prostate cancer field, the effect of feeding back data to clinicians about their outcomes. And we looked at 2 outcomes here. The one is the reduction in residual tumor left behind after surgery, same one as the breast cancer one I showed you earlier. So what proportion of people have got prostate cancerous tissue still left behind after their surgery? And the purple line is basically late adopters of use of the registry. So this was a group who didn't get any feedback. The orange group did get feedback. And you'll see for both the residual tumor rates and the reduction in overtreatment of people who had mild cases of cancer, the substantially better improvement over time in the group of institutions and providers who got feedback. And this was just simply a function of the phased rollout of the registry compared to those who didn't get feedback. So certainly it looks like they're responding to that feedback. And this is an example that I actually stole from our next speaker, so he can't use it in his talk, but he's certainly responsible for one of the organizations and facilities that generated this. For the last 25 years or so, we have been measuring outcomes from arthroplasties, hip and knee replacements in Australia. This chart shows one set of arthroplasties, hip replacements, that actually had significantly worse outcomes than any of the prostheses that were being used before. Those were reported back through annual reports to all orthopedic surgeons in Australia, and you'll see there, they're shown, those dodgy prostheses are shown as each of these lines, and they all decline pretty kind of sharply from about 2005-06 onwards. The TGA only stopped registering that prosthesis in 2009, and the manufacturer withdrew it from the market in the US in 2010, by which stage nobody was using it anymore. So this is a very good instance of how clinicians actually do respond to data about what they're doing and act on it pretty much a lot quicker than interesting regulators or manufacturers do. And then the last myth, which I'm going to ignore my time signal and tell you about this last slide. There's not a very forceful timekeeper we've got at the front here. But you'll be interested in this one. Yeah, okay. The last myth is around how much does it cost to do this. And we did a very interesting study just looking at how much it costs to generate this data and the benefits you get from it. And the benefit to cost ratios of running these data collection exercises are of the order of 2 to 6 or 7 to 1. So certainly we can, I think, rightfully claim it's worth the investment. Thanks very much.